March 7th, 1965. State and local police attack defenseless citizens on a quiet Sunday afternoon in what will become known as Bloody Sunday. And if this is the type of content that you enjoy, you can find more content like this at onemichistory.com. But without further ado, let's get started. During Jim Crow, Black people faced tons of obstacles just trying to vote. They had poll taxes, literacy tests. They had to deal with rules that were deliberately confusing. The Black voters who tried to exercise their ability to vote also faced serious threats, including violence and lynching. This oppression not only stopped individuals from voting, but it also supported the ongoing racism in the Southern United States. Following protests like sit-ins, campaigns, was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex. It aimed to stop segregation in schools and public locations and even at the workplace. But African Americans still face issues voting. It was clear that more laws are needed to protect the voting rights of African Americans. Meanwhile, in Dallas County, Alabama, where the enforcement of Jim Crow laws was especially stout, African Americans made up 50% of the local population, but only 2% of the registered voters. In the face of severe disenfranchisement, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference arrived in Selma in January of 1965. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had already been planning in Alabama before King's arrival as part of a broader mission to secure voting rights for African Americans, and King aimed to bring national attention to the intense hurdles that African Americans faced when attempting to vote. This set a volatile stage in Selma, Alabama, which the Southern Christian Leadership Conference aimed to try to compel a swift federal reaction, with the ultimate goal introducing wide-ranging voting rights legislation. A multifaceted strategy was adopted, including peaceful protests, deliberate acts of civil disobedience, and education-based programs, all aiming at instigating change and garnering national attention to the peaceful protests. But they were met with a severe backlash. Thousands of protesters ended up in jail as they stood up for the right to vote. Racial tensions remained high through much of 1965. Alabama would see tensions peak in Selma and the neighboring town of Marion, which formed an epicenter of these protests. Local white officials held the reins tight on voter registration, and these discriminatory practices turned both cities into strategic cornerstones for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference push for voting rights legislation. These tensions were amplified by Sheriff Jim Clark of Selma, who was notoriously against the idea of African American enfranchisement. Then, on February 18th of 1965, in Marion, Alabama, a peaceful march turned violent when state troopers brutally attacked the demonstrators. In the chaos, 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson, an African-American man, was shot attempting to protect his mother from being beaten by state troopers. He would tragically die from his injuries. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death proved a pivotal moment for the civil rights movement and galvanized leaders with a renewed sense of urgency in the fight for justice. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they decided to organize a march that would not only be a tribute to Jimmy Lee Jackson, but a powerful statement demanding justice and voting rights for all African Americans. It aimed to show the country and the federal government the critical need for the law that would guarantee the voting rights for every citizen, regardless of race. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had planned a march that would cover 54 miles from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital. As they carefully planned, they held workshops on the principles of nonviolence, coordinated with local community officials to ensure that the march would be peaceful. On March 6, 1965, Governor George Wallace publicly condemned the proposed march as he considered it a significant threat to public safety. Emphasizing his commitment to maintaining order, he was adamant that there would be no march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, according to Wallace. All necessary means will be implemented to thwart the realization of the march. He vowed to take a firm stance against the marchers, emphasizing the imperative nature of public safety in these challenging times. In a direct challenge to Alabama Governor George Wallace, civil rights leaders continued to formulate their plan for the 54-mile march. Martin Luther King, who had recently consulted with President Lyndon B. Johnson regarding the enactment of voting rights legislation, delayed his participation in the march and intended on joining them about halfway through the following day. So the leadership roles for the march were determined by a coin toss. Hosa Williams, who represented the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and John Lewis, who was the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were selected to spearhead this movement. On March 7th, 1965, a group of about 600 protesters gathered at Brown Chapel AME Zion Church. Beginning the march in the heart of downtown Selma, Alabama, demonstrators moved unhindered, but as they ventured towards the Edmund Peters Bridge, which ironically was named after a Confederate general turned Ku Klux Klan leader, they felt the tensions of confrontations past and those yet to come. As marchers ascended the bridge, they encountered a barricade of state troopers and local law enforcement officers. The officials, wearing white helmets, tapped their billy clubs and formed a formidable wall at the exit of the bridge. Positioned behind them were spectating locals, enthusiastically brandishing Confederate flags, waiting with bated breath for the possible clash. Despite knowing the imminent danger, the marchers kept moving forward, maintaining a steady stream along the sidewalk. They would halt about 50 feet away from law enforcement officials. Major John Cloud, speaking on a bullhorn, would warn them, "It would be detrimental to your safety to continue this march. It is an unlawful assembly. Disperse." However, the leaders were undeterred and stepped forward to engage the officers. There was an attempt at a peaceful negotiations, but they made no headway with Cloud, who promptly rebuffed their request for talks. This was followed by a tense period of standstill before complete pandemonium broke loose. The officers encroached upon them with tear gas and billy clubs, forcing the marchers to retreat. The air was filled with a horrible amalgamation of screams and cheers. This terrifying altercation left a deep imprint, both physically and mentally, turning an attempted peaceful protest into what became known as Bloody Sunday. The ruthless assault on the peaceful march served as a stark testament to the resilience that the civil rights movement regularly faced. After the violence ceased, 17 people were rushed to the hospital and another 50 needed medical attention for less severe injuries. The media coverage of Bloody Sunday was pivotal in shaping the nation's reaction. Television networks displayed the chilling scenes of the assault to tens of millions of households across the country. The horrifying moment, the ABC News opted to halt a TV premiere of The Judgment of Nuremberg, a film that centered around the post-World War II Nazi crime tribunals, with on-screen footage of tumultuous events unfolding here in the United States, left an indelible mark on the nation. The footage of defenseless citizens being savagely beaten by law enforcement officers on a quiet Sunday afternoon jolted the American public. It drastically swayed public opinion in favor of the civil rights movement and prompted greater numbers of people from various racial and religious backgrounds and sparked widespread demonstrations and support for the Selma marchers in about 80 cities across the United States. During this unrest, Martin Luther King, along with thousands of others, traveled to Selma. But meanwhile, in Montgomery, U.S. District Court Judge Franklin Johnson Jr. temporarily halted the march by issuing a restraining order till he evaluated the case. President Lyndon B. Johnson felt compelled to act because of the national outcry and took a firm stance in the wake of the tragedy. He condemned aggression against the peaceful marchers and saw Bloody Sunday as a turning point for civil rights legislation. Understanding this pivotal role of federal intervention, Johnson addressed the nation on March 15, 1965, asserting that the United States was founded on the principle that all men are created equal and that the time has come for African Americans to have the right to vote. His speech concluded with the famous phrase that we shall overcome, aligning themselves with the civil rights movement. This public address outlined the administration's commitment to passing what would become the Voting Rights Act of 1965, a landmark legislation designed to eradicate the legal barriers placed by state and local officials to prevent African Americans from exercising their right to vote. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, civil rights leaders were undeterred by the violence in Selma. organized 2 more marches. On March 9th, King led a racially diverse group of protesters back to the Edmund Peters Bridge, only to turn around at the bridge. Judge Johnson, on March 17th, eventually sided with the demonstrators in affirming the right of large groups to petition the government publicly in a march along public streets and highways. A federally protected procession of approximately 3,200 advocates for voting rights embarked on a bold march from Selma to Montgomery on March 21st, trekking 12 miles a day and resting in fields at night. By the time they reached the state capitol on March 25th, their ranks had swelled to almost 25,000. This peaceful protest became a pivotal moment in the struggle for racial injustice and voting rights, and showcased the strength of nonviolent resistance and the power of collective action. The impact of Bloody Sunday and the subsequent events were not limited to the United States alone. News coverage and media action vividly captured the volatility of the American race relations and the broad struggle for civil rights. As a result, the issue of civil rights in the United States took center stage on an international scene, prompting discourse on human rights and encouraging solidarity with the movements abroad. Countries around the globe became increasingly invested in American civil rights movement and offered moral support and crucial scrutiny of U.S. domestic policy. The increased national and international awareness of civil rights prompted by Bloody Sunday made it abundantly clear that systemic oppression of African Americans was not merely a regional problem, but a pervasive national crisis. This amplified the national consciousness into political pressure and legislative action. Only 5 months after the assault at the Edmund Peters Bridge, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law by President Johnson. The shocking pictures of Bloody Sunday showed defenseless protesters being brutally attacked by police, and these images made many, many more people understand and support the civil rights movement. The contrast between the peaceful protesters and the violent response they received made protesters seem even more important. Bloody Sunday stirred more people to fight for civil rights, not just in America, but around the world. This legacy of Bloody Sunday has endured far beyond 1965 and inspired generations of activists to engage in the ongoing fight for injustice. As a symbol, it has invoked the quest for equality in various arenas, serving as a testament to the power of nonviolent resistance and as a reminder to the sacrifices that resistance often demands. Over the years, the annual commemoration across the Edmund Peters Bridge has attracted people from all walks of life and unified the spirit of progress and paid homage to civil rights heroes of our past. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy. This has been One Mic History. If you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemichistory.com. I would like to thank all my members and my Patreon subscribers. Without you, none of this could be possible. Thank you. Peace.